Welcome, everyone. I know there's a few more people to join in. You'll get my introduction whenever you see the recording. My name is Jonathan Grady. I'm here hosting today. Got a very interesting presentation for you. Now, my young fella, if you can believe this, Chris, my young fella was asking me today, oddly enough, about metadata, and I didn't really have an adequate response for him. I didn't really know how to present the challenges that he was facing when it came to metadata, but I figured, hey, you might know. So I told him, Jackson, I'll answer all your metadata questions after today's webinar. And if I could, maybe I'll let you take over, and that's how we'll get started here.
We've got an hour, so I'm sure we will cover every single possible thing a person can know about metadata. So let me share my presentation. There we go. That to the side, and welcome. My name is Chris Day. I am the Metadata Librarian at Discovery Garden. And before that, I spent 15 years in academic libraries, managing metadata and managing digital collections at Providence College in Rhode Island and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based on my own experiences, my experiences here at Discovery Garden. And my plan is to talk a little bit about metadata in general, talk a little bit about best practices in general, and then talk about metadata as it exists in Islandora and how that can help you with your best practices. So, first of all, what is metadata? Here's the question that was asked earlier. And being a librarian, giving a presentation about metadata, I have to first present you the slide with the basic description. Metadata is data about data. And after I show that, I have to show you the picture of data with metadata on it. So that's those things out of the way. A more descriptive and helpful definition, which I found on dictionary.archivist.org, is that metadata is information about data that promotes discovery, structures data objects, and supports the administration and preservation of records. So there are a lot of different types of metadata. The main groups, people either give 3 main categories of metadata or up to 5, are descriptive metadata, and that is information to identify and distinguish a resource from other things. So titles, creators, subjects. Administrative metadata, which is the data that is needed to help manage the resource. And that can be broken down into technical metadata, which describes the physical nature of the resource. So you've got format and size and digitization lifecycle. You have preservation metadata to help ensure the long-term storage and usability of digital content. And that's things like checksums, software, hardware information, transformation history. And you have rights metadata to identify who has access to a resource and what they can do with it. And then finally, structural metadata, which is used to describe how all the pieces work together. It combines all the other metadata together with the actual digital files or digital objects, whatever you are describing. What I'm going to be focusing on during this presentation is descriptive metadata, but as I'll point out, basically all the categories combined. It's a big Venn diagram. So everything works together and shares the questions that they're trying to answer.
Excellent.
So one of those, yeah, please.
If you don't mind, Chris, if I can interrupt. So great introduction, especially for anybody who might not know too much about metadata. I'm guessing as a metadata specialist yourself, you've been to several metadata presentations, right? And after your last couple of slides there, especially the one with data, are those regular jokes? Can we expect that? Can I expect that the next time I go to a metadata presentation?
Librarians love a Brett Spinner metadata joke. I have seen numerous wonderful Halloween costumes, Data holding a tiny data in his hand. So yes, I felt I needed to get that in somehow.
Oh, hey, we appreciate that. And just as we're getting kicked off here, for anybody attending, feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Maybe we can get a sense of who's attending. Is this the first metadata session that you've attended? Have you attended others in the past? Maybe let us know just in the chat there. But yeah, Chris, sorry, please
No
continue.
problem. So yeah, as I was saying, let's start with the question of why does metadata matter? And some of the reasons are in the title of this presentation. Some have already been mentioned, but there is a document called the FAIR Principles that was originally published in 2016 by a group of scientists in the journal Scientific Data. And this breaks it down into the letters for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse. And these categories are applied to metadata, they're applied to the actual data itself, they're applied to the structures, the digital repositories. But as far as metadata goes, some of the things that are talked about in these various categories, having a unique and persistent identifier, describing the object with rich metadata so that you could find it even if you didn't have that identifier, and to give metadata that gives the context for how the data is to be used and if it will meet your specific needs. So those hit everything that we're going to be talking about. And one of the tools that are available are the various standards that the communities have developed to help to help organize metadata and help us define what it is. Those can be broken down into categories like metadata structure, data content standards, data value standards, data exchange standards. Metadata structure standards are things like metadata schema that describe the fields that you might be using to describe something. Data content standards are guides to how you would format the values that you are putting into those fields. Data value standards help define the terms that you would be using in some of those fields. And data exchange standards help describe the container that you would be grouping that metadata with, things like RDF, XML, and MARC. And best practices is about choosing the right standards that fit your specific needs and the needs of your communities, both internal and external. So let's look at some of those metadata structure standards, some of the schema to begin with. One of the most well-used and the one that is most relevant to Islandora and the Islandora community is MODS. And MODS was put together to create a version of MARC. MARC being the standard and format that most library catalogs use. So it was designed that way so that librarians would be able to adopt it with ease, so that you could bring records in from a library catalog into the MODS data with little loss of information. So in Islandora 7, the previous version of Islandora, that's what we went with. We went with MODS XML just to ease that sort of communication between systems. And then when Islandora Modern was being created, decided to continue with MODS to continue to attract those same communities, but also ease the migration from one version of Islandora to the other. MODS is a group of about 20 top-level elements. That's what I've got on the slide right there. But then you expand those with various attributes and around 125 sub-elements, which break the categories into smaller pieces. It's also extensible. You can bring in elements from other schema. So if MODS is not letting you describe something in the precise way that you would like, you can bring in fields from another schema and use some of those. And I've highlighted access condition, which is how MODS describes rights. Just to show you, this is descriptive metadata, but there is rights metadata worked right into it. And we'll see that repeated in some of the other schema that we take a look at. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about some of the groupings within MODS, just to show you how the elements and sub-elements work together. So title info breaks down into a series of fields so that you can describe things like in the examples I've got on the right, breaking out the non-sort portion of the title, and then the title itself, and then the subtitle, part number and part name, all of which help you better search, better format, better present. It's the same sort of things that you'd be doing in MARC. And then there's various types of title: uniform, alternative, abbreviated. Looking on at name element not only has sub elements for things like alternative name and display form and role, but it also has attributes which let you describe what type of name this is. Is this a personal name? Is this the name of a corporate body or an organization? Is this just the name of a family? And then also this field is used for the names of conferences. And that's another one that we'll return to a little bit later when we talk about Islandora. And then origin info is the last one I wanted to take a little bit more of a look in. This is an element which contains 14 sub-elements to describe either publication or manufacturer information about the digital object. So place of publication, publisher, various date fields, edition and frequency for serials, and 8 separate date fields so that you can describe things like date issued, date created, date value, valid, and date modified. Then, as a alternative to MODS, there is Dublin Core, which is a much simpler metadata schema. It's just 15 terms. And it was originally created for describing web resources. The idea was to have as simple a system as possible so that there was a low barrier for web designers, people who are creating web resources, to describe those resources. And because it's so simple, that allows it to serve as a crosswalk between systems. We'll see how it helps you communicate from, say, Islandora into an ILS in a little bit. And there in orange, once again, rights. So again, rights metadata is a category, but it's a part of most metadata schema. And then building off of the base Dublin Core is qualified Dublin Core, which has a total of 55 terms. This was a little bit more of an advanced version. And so in the examples I'm giving right there, this isn't all 55 terms, but I wanted to show you how what was in base Dublin Core, the title field, then they expanded that. So there's both title and alternative. Before there was just a single date field, but then now it's doing something like MODS was doing and breaking that out into a copyright date and date issued and date modified, etc. And relation, to describe the relationship of this object to others, is also much more specific to describe relationships both ways, that it has a part or it is a part, that it is referenced by or it is a reference to. So qualified Dublin Core is further building off of Dublin Core, and then also something that is used as a crosswalk. But these are very generalized schema, trying to fit and be usable for as many types of objects and repositories as possible. But metadata standards need to reflect the needs of their communities and their materials. So other schema have been developed to describe specific material with specific purposes in mind. And I just want to mention a few of those. The first one is VRA Core, and that was developed to describe cultural objects, paintings and sculptures and furniture. So it has fields that are a little bit more specific, like cultural context, which is describing sort of the nature of the people who created this work, Inscription, another field. Material and measurements are examples of fields. There are similar ones to those in both MODS and Dublin Core, but the direction and the focus of the fields is different when describing an object from, say, an art museum. Building off of those for even more specific types of collections is something called Costume Core. And it based itself on things like VRA Core in order to describe collections of garments, focusing a little bit more on collections of historic garments, having fields that would not be broken out in Dublin Core, colors and silhouette and neckline and torso, all sorts of specific measurements fields. I actually used a version of this. I built a collection off of MODS and Costume Core for a more modern garment collection. And there we were able to use Costume Core as a base, but go even more specific, if that is possible, to dozens and dozens of fields, recording the very specific things. You can go very specific. And another core, just to complete the core trilogy, Darwin Core. And this is used to describe organisms, animals, plants, as well. So information about those organisms, as well as information about the observation of those organisms. So you've got your kingdom, phylum, class, order breakdown, but also fields for describing the occurrence of the sighting, the time and the place, the life stage of the organism at the time, reproductive condition, behavior. Again, things that you wouldn't necessarily need when describing a collection of newspapers, but for the right collection, these are necessary. And in fact, we actually have had clients who have had Darwin Core as a part of their repository. So we added the fields that were specific to their needs to Islandora for them to continue using. And the last one I wanted to point out is ETDMS. This is an adoption of Dublin Core, adding a handful of fields in order to describe electronic theses and dissertations. So uses Dublin Core for things like title and creator, et cetera, but then adds fields like the degree name, the degree level, which means undergraduate, master's, or doctoral, degree discipline, and degree grantor. So these are very simple fields, but can turn any collection into the start of an institutional repository for those needs. And I mentioned that we had a client that had the Darwin Core. They actually had a good number of specific schema that were built into their mods. So, for example, the EDs. This is an example of mods XML. It just sticks an element called extension in there, and then within that, the fields that are specific to that schema and to the specific object. And then this is how Darwin Core looks. And we've got the various descriptive as well as scientific name, authorship, and when it was recorded by location remarks. And then finally, one I didn't talk about, this is for digital geospatial metadata of the Federal Geographic Data Committee. So an alternate way of describing, in this case, bounding coordinates for an object. And in the case of this client, they were a statewide consortial project. So they had material coming from universities, from museums, from libraries, with all sorts of different subject matter. So they had to bring in these various schema to help explore the specific points of some of those collections that were bringing it in and letting it all work together.
Chris,
And then
if I can interrupt there, if you don't mind, could you go back to your previous slide there? What are those numbers describing? Are those
coordinates? Yes. Yeah. East, west, north, south bounding coordinates.
And so what type of object would this be? Like, obviously we don't see the other metadata fields. Like, is it an acreage? Is it a farm? Is that kind of what we're describing here? Something that could be like that? So like you were actually describing a physical location as the object, or Like what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm afraid I don't know. I don't remember from the object that I took the screenshot from. Sorry
Oh,
about
okay.
that.
But no problem. But is that like the type of object that it could be describing? It doesn't have to
Yes,
be, it could be out in the
yes.
field somewhere. It's away
It could be
from
maps. It could
action.
be,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay. So one thing I was wondering about there as you were describing these was like you've mentioned the locality or local nature, community nature of the collection as being important to some of these fields that you're creating. When you did the costume related
yes.
collection that you did yourself and you were adding in those extra fields, like what type of specific categorization were you creating there to like what made yours, the
Yeah,
local schema, different than say the overall costume core
sure.
that's available?
That specific collection was for like I said, a garment collection that was focusing on modern garments for a fashion school. So it was the collection focused on very modern, very cutting edge type of materials. So that also included things like hats and purses and shoes, as well as tops and so forth. So we started with the costume core fields, but then added more specific measurements or things like trying to remember.
Maybe what class the project was for, things like that.
No, but
Apps.
things like what were hate to say cutting edge again, but the techniques that were used, what it is an example of, also that the collection could be used more as a teaching collection so that the metadata was focused on what the faculty needed in order to demonstrate what these pieces were, and so that students could access it, because while it was a public collection, things would have to be, this digital collection was allowing us to have a stage between picking out an object and having to have it pulled from the collection. So it cut down on the amount of handling.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, no, that's great stuff. I appreciate that. I'll let you continue.
Sure. So I wanted to very briefly, looking at time, talk about, without going into too many details, that there are then schema that fit into the various categories. So technical metadata, there is FITS, the file information tool set, which has fields for different media types, size, and so forth. Preservation has premise, which is preservation metadata implementation strategies. So that's describing the history of the objects and what various actions are performed on those objects to keep a history of provenance of the digital items. Rights, as I was pointing out, is a part of a lot of different metadata schema, but the California Digital Library actually developed something called Copyright MD, which goes much more into detail, really lets you precisely describe information about copyright and when copyright was last checked and when copyright might be expiring and so forth. And then for structural, there's METS, which is an XML format which brings everything together. So it has some of its own fields, but then it will have the descriptive metadata, the technical metadata, as little chunks of information that is a part of that overall structure. So then touching a little bit on metadata content standards. And as I said, these are the things that help you decide how to form the values that are going into those fields. And again, there are different standards for different types of communities. Resource description and access, RDA, is what is used by MARC. And so it's often used for MODS, so that if you wanted to reflect the way data was being presented in your ILS, in your digital collection, you'd be using RDA, for example. Cataloging cultural objects. Again, cultural objects. You would use this in conjunction with VRA core or even costume core. And it goes into detailed guidelines how to put together, say, the title for an object, how to choose the preferred title for a piece of art, how to capitalize or abbreviate it, how to construct a title for an object that doesn't have one to begin with. And then for archives, there is DAX, describing how to form information if you were, say, constructing an EAD finding aid or so forth, or even just describing the material in your digital collection. And then looking at value standards and taxonomies, these are where we're pulling the terms. And we're pulling the terms from these taxonomies so that we're using the same terminology that other collections are, so that the communication can go much more easily between collections. I just wanted to start off by pointing out some of the ones that the Library of Congress manage. Library of Congress subject headings is probably the most used taxonomy that is around, but they also have specific ones for graphic materials, for genre and form terms. There's the LC name authority file, and just wanted to use, I chose Andy Warhol as an example. So here is how Andy Warhol is presented in the name authority file. And we'll see that can be slightly different in different taxonomies, which is why you would pick one to go with your specific project. Then we get a variety of taxonomies that were created by the Getty Institute. They have a thesaurus for geographic names, an art and architecture thesaurus for subject terms and genre terms and form terms. They have their own list of artist names that will often have names that wouldn't exist in the Library of Congress name authorities, because this is specifically focused on art and artists. They even have a cultural objects name authority for getting a standardized name for various pieces of art. And in the ULON, the Union List of Artist Names, that's where we get a fuller version of Andy Warhol with the parentheses American painter, printmaker, and filmmaker, because they're breaking it out a little bit more. And there's an example of a few of the pieces of Warhol's that are in the Cultural Objects Name Authority. And then there's a variety of others. The VIAF, the Virtual International Authority file, basically authorities for names from a variety of taxonomies and systems from throughout the globe. So I have two examples there, one from France and one from Russia, on the way they're formatting Andy Warhol's name. And then there's more subject-based ones. There's MESH, which is medical subject headings. Rights have their own taxonomies. There's things like rightstatement.org and Creative Commons. And then, of course, you will have the need for a local vocabulary. None of these are going to meet every single need that you have. You can have a name that is important enough to be pulled out in your repository, but they don't exist in LC subject headings. But you want to be consistent in that name's use in your repository, so you develop a local vocabulary. And then there's things like Wikidata, which people are using to crowd build vocabularies. That's where a lot of people add their local vocabularies, because it gives you the same things like a permanent identifier for a name that you can add to your collection.
Sorry, guys, I just want to interrupt here. We're having some issues with our chat. People can't see or contribute to the chat. So we do have, under the meeting tools, there is a Q&A tool where you can ask a question, and there's moderators in the background here who can answer. So it's under meeting tools. Should be the bottom right-hand corner of your browser. Looks like a little menu bar. If you look for Q&A, you should be able to ask questions in there. Sorry, continue.
No problem. Thanks, Karen. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about accessible and reusable, which are some of the more important things about your metadata, because you want to make your metadata available not just to your own distinct community, but share that metadata with the wider community. And there are various levels that people do that on. One of the biggest sort of union collections in the internet for at least the United States is the Digital Public Library of America. It serves as a central location where collections and repositories set themselves up so that their records are harvested into the DPLA, some basic information, and it's not sucking the actual objects in, but it's giving pointers so that someone can be searching for a topic in DPLA and pointed and redirected to an object in your collection, or an object in another university's collection, or an object in a small private library's collection. And it uses the qualified Dublin Core as its metadata base so that It can meet as many institutions' needs, but it's not lossless sharing. You can't provide all the metadata you have in your own system, which is why they redirect you from the DPLA to your own objects. They have guidelines, which are available, basically best practices for contributing to the DPLA. And they have things like, at a minimum, they want each record to have a title, to have rights information, to have the data provider, which is your name, the name of the collection, and then is shown at. So a link that they can provide, a permanent identifier link to redirect someone to your collection. And then the guidelines further have recommendations to improve other aspects of your metadata. And then even a level of this is what a perfect record would be if coming into the DPLA. So this is a hub that's very important for a lot of institutions. And then there's consortial collections. One that we've worked with a couple of times is Mountain West Digital Libraries. And it serves as a partner, as like a hub to the DPLA. So Mountain West Digital Libraries has a whole collection of universities and libraries, museums centered around Utah, Nevada, and Oregon that they harvest first into their collection, and then DPLA harvests from their collection. So again, they're using Dublin Core and qualified Dublin Core, and they have they ask for a few more fields. So they ask for things like date and format and type, in addition to the fields that make up the DPLA minimum, because they want to be as a usable site. So they're asking for a little bit more from their members.
Chris, before you move on from this slide, sorry, we had a question from Alice Lubbock. Do you know of any more international versions of the DPLA? She works with collections from across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East.
Yeah, I believe, one second. Sorry, what was that?
WorldCat?
Yes, and I'll actually touch on your WorldCat a little bit, but there's also, I believe it's called Europeana, and I don't know why my brain is freezing on that serves basically as a DPLA for European sites. And they've got their own base of metadata requirements and so forth. But that's the biggest one that I can think of that's specifically focused outside of the US. But speaking of WorldCat, that's another place that you might want harvesting your records. You either so that you have objects working into the large WorldCat Union catalog, or because you want to use it as a stepping stone to get records first into WorldCat and then bring those records into your local ILS. And if you're going to do that, maybe you want to follow RDA standards a little bit more so that your mapping looks a little bit more like the other records in the WorldCat. But Dublin Core is often the standard for harvesting. There are a lot of harvesters. WorldCat has one built in, and they only have so many fields. Many library systems, ILSs, also have harvesting systems set up. And the ones I've worked with have also used Dublin Core for bringing things in. And if you're contributing to catalogs like these, you end up wanting to think about what you are giving them. Are you giving them records that describe an entire collection? Is that the way that you want to expose your stuff, where you have a collection within your collection and you want to have a record in WorldCat about that? Or do you want them harvesting all the records in your collection? Maybe not sticking all of the records into WorldCat, but your local ILS, that is a great place where students could come across your material in a different way. So all things to think about when exploring those options. Here we go. And then I wanted to talk about the metadata application profile. So this is a way of formalizing your best practices. And I've got an example here. This is actually from, no, sorry, I don't remember which I got this from Metadata Application Profile repository, which I've linked to on this page. And it basically, what this does is you're breaking down like which fields are required, what the definition of fields, what vocabularies to use for fields, any notes for the people that are going to be describing the material, so that it's a guide for the people who are adding material to your digital collection so that they are doing it consistently from user to user, from collection to collection. So this is often the endpoint of looking at all of these standards. So I know I'm going to quickly go through metadata in Islandora here at the end. Like I mentioned before, metadata in Islandora is based on MODS, but it's not really MODS because it used to be a MODS XML file. So it was strict and it was validated so that everything was perfectly formatted. But now it lives in a Drupal database. It is just a set of fields that can be a little flat. So it's reproducing the functionality of MODS without having to stick to the strict structure of MODS. And then it also adds fields for more specific purposes. Drupal handles different information differently than other databases might. So we've had to take advantage of that and maybe split something out that could have been described more succinctly with attributes and types. And now it's separate fields. So Discovery Garden has a set of 92 fields, including plus an additional 64 in paragraphs that I'll mention. But no one client of ours uses all of those fields. They often bring their own fields. We see about an average of 62 active fields, but we've had clients that had up to 138 fields that they were using.
Is there any real limit? Not really, eh?
Not really, other than becoming unmanageable. If you have so many fields that it slows the system down when it comes to indexing, so that it makes it very difficult to tell people or for people to know what they're actually filling out. Those are the reasons to limit some of the field growth.
Okay, excellent. Just see a question here quickly in the comment. Bill is asking for the slides after the session. And yes, Bill, I'll send those out to anybody who wants them.
Great. So I think I briefly said the word paragraph a second ago. Discovery Garden uses paragraphs. It's an Islandora function that, in the way that we're using, lets us create a chunk of fields. And that chunk then is repeatable. And this is used for a couple of the places to reproduce the element sub-element structure that we saw in MODS XML. So for instance, the title of an object. There is a required title that comes with every object, which, because of the database construction, the way Drupal works, it's limited to 255 characters. But then we have a paragraph that has a field for the title, a field for title type, so alternative, abbreviated, uniform, as well as fields for part name and part number. And this way you can either include a fuller version of the title that has part name or has more than 255 characters, or you can just keep repeating it to give alternative titles that go along with the title and that have all that information built in. So that's one of the functions of Drupal that we take advantage of to help reconstruct MODS. Names, because names had that type that let you say whether it was personal or an organization, we actually have separate fields now, breaking it up into specifically persons' names and organizations. But in order to keep that role information, what the role of the name is, there was actually a new field type called type relation that was developed that connects a list of terms to the name so that you can say Abraham Lincoln was the author of this digitized object. And the name and the role are connected there. And then the persons and the organizations fields are also connected to taxonomies, which I'll touch on a little bit more in a second, which have their own metadata fields in them. So you can incorporate even more information that can potentially be used and shared with your users. And then briefly, origin information. This was one of the ones with lots of fields in MODS, and we've recreated that in the paragraph, repeatable, and many of the fields within the paragraph are repeatable. And this has all the fields that you would normally find in the origin info element within MODS. But we've broken out from MODS in order to meet specific needs that clients might have, or to do things that Drupal wouldn't let us do otherwise. So for instance, we have a field called administrative notes. And in MODS, you have note and a note type, which includes administration. You can have a note that's administration. And we have a note paragraph, which includes those two things. But the need came up to have a note that was administrative in the way that it wasn't made accessible to the public, that this has management information or information that you want to keep with the object, but not share with the public. So we made a separate note so that we could specifically control the access to that field and the display of that field. Then there are a lot of things that would have been handled with a type, like in MODS, related item can have a type of series. So we broke out into a series paragraph rather than make that a part of the related item fields. I mentioned earlier that names can have a type of conference. So we broke that out so that there could be a separate conference and event fields. And then we did a lot of work looking at systems that handled institutional repositories and worked to add fields that, again, weren't necessarily represented in MODS, but that would be needed for, or potentially needed for, an institutional repository. So funder information, sponsor information, publication status, conflict of interest statement, even a group of fields that are grouped around publication, so that if, say, your repository had an article, these fields would be what you would use to describe the publication that article first appeared in, or the book that chapter first appeared in. All things that could be done in various ways in MODS, but we were breaking them out so that they could be presented, so they could be displayed, so they could be recorded in Drupal in a specific way. And then for each client, we end up creating fields based on their specific needs. So that first bullet point on the left breaks out all the identifier fields that we have in our default settings. And that's a whole lot. Everything from local identifier to GPO item number, OCLC number, and some PubMed numbers. But even still, some systems want to break out information separately. So we've created fields like collection identifier, symphony identifier, publisher's number. Same with classification. I've got right there the 4 classification fields that we use, but then we had a client that needed to record the catalog of life classification. So a field was created for that. And then we've also created fields specific to the needs of some state libraries. So one state library had a collection where they needed to collect various statutes as they were being presented in the legislature, and needed very specific information to be searchable and filterable on. So there was a whole series of fields describing who submitted this legislation, when it was submitted, when it was last updated, and so forth. Another one for a Canadian province had very specific needs because they wanted to record what session and what day this item had been submitted into the record. So the collections build. This is where those numbers grow up to 138 as we're specifically meeting the needs. And then the nice thing is there are a lot of ways that Drupal helps you enforce best practices. One is that there are specific field types in Drupal. So you can have a text field and you can have a long text field. So for things like genre terms, you maybe just have a plain text field. But for things like title or abstract, where you are going to have much more than 255 characters, there's a longer field for that. And then even a different field for allowing HTML formatting or other things like that. So you could not use that field type if you wanted to restrict people from adding material. There's the typed relation field that I talked about. There's geolocation, which is for recording coordinates. And it's one of the reasons that we didn't use that for those bounding coordinates that we were showing earlier was the geolocation field handles 2 different coordinates. So sometimes you would use that and sometimes you would build your own one. The nice thing with the geolocation field is then it can communicate to other parts of Drupal to help build maps and so forth, if you so desired. And then there's date fields. The Islandora community decided to go with the EDTF standard for date fields. And there is a specific EDTF field in Drupal. This is a format that's similar to things like ISO 8601. I've got some examples here on the left. So it's a standard that would match what most institutions would possibly already be using. But then it has characters that you can add for things like add a question mark, and it can display that the date is uncertain, or the date is approximate, or that there's unspecified digits within a date, even describing the open end of a date range. But because it is an EDTF field, it won't allow you. You can't just type January 01, you have to type 0101. And then there's, of course, the possibility of making fields required. You can have a field that has to be filled out. Title is one of them that's built in, but if you wanted, say, everyone has to add one subject, or everybody has to add a resource type, those can be made required too. And then there's taxonomies, which I mentioned. Taxonomies are basically a way of having a controlled vocabulary within your Islandora site. So these are vocabularies that you construct by terms, and you can have those taxonomies connect to specific fields. So the person's taxonomy is connected to the person's field, and the subject taxonomy is connected to the subject field. And then there's some things like resource type, where we have preloaded the DCMI resource types or the LC resource types. And you can connect it to that and set it so that it can only use the fields that are in the pre-recorded vocabulary, while other fields like subject would build the vocabulary as you go. And the nice thing about these, we've also set them up with a way of recording authority source information. So you can record the specific authority that you were drawing that field from, and even record the URI for that authority, helping to set the base for eventual use in linked data, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, the taxonomies have their own fields. So the person's taxonomy has that authority source that I mentioned, but also you can include information like the ORCID ID or alternative names, their position within an institution, department, affiliation, et cetera. There's a whole long stream, and we've had clients that then use those to create landing pages for faculty members. It can be used, it cannot be used.
I can't believe how much data there is about data.
Yes,
You know
no,
what I mean?
and like I said, this is such a minuscule portion of what this world is. But in summary, the things that I wanted to make sure I repeated by the end is that best practices are at their heart local practices. You may be guided by community standards. You may be guided by taxonomies that the Library of Congress have put together, but you are choosing what fields you're actually using. You're choosing how to format the values in these fields. You're choosing how you want to communicate with your users. And by establishing those best practices, you not only can set up consistency within your collection between projects within a collection, but you can also set yourself up to better communicate with other collections and share your data in a wider way. And Islandora does a very good job of working on the base of MODS to take care of those things, to help you with your standards and to help you share your information past your one repository. So that's what I have. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I think we're almost at the hour, but I believe we've probably got some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. And so, as Chris mentioned there, we will stick around for a few extra minutes. I know that we're being at the top of the hour, we probably have some people that need to run, but if there are any questions, feel free to throw those into the chat or into the Q&A. I know that the chat is working for some people, but not for everyone. So Yeah, but Chris, that was excellent. So much data about data. The thing that I'm most fascinated by is how local standards can differ, right? Obviously, the local standards are going to differ, but in a way that everybody is able to read them, right? I think that's probably one of the most important parts of creating a metadata schema would be that somebody who has never seen this repository before but needs to know what that piece of content means or the data in and around that piece of content, it should be able to be accessible by anybody regardless of them not knowing the local standards, right?
Yeah, because there's information that an institution or an archive or whatever that they want to record about an object, stuff they want to keep track of for their purposes. But then there's the information that other people want when they're coming to your data. They may not care about some of the subject terms that you're using, but they are going to care very much about when this was published because they need to know if this is a recent resource or an old resource, or they need to know, what programs, like if you've got a repository with pieces of data in it, they need to know, oh, I can use this in Excel when I download it, or this is formatted in such a way that I need to have Photoshop in order to use it. There's information based on needs at all of those levels.
Right, that's excellent. All right. Hey, for anybody here, if there are any other questions that come in after we break off here, feel free to send me an email. Everybody has an email from me. I've invited everyone to the session. And if you do have any more questions, I'll be happy to connect you with Chris. But Chris, this was an excellent session. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And for everybody still here, thanks for sticking around all the way until the end. That's excellent. Oh, Paula
raised her hand.
She's asked us to stick around. Let me see if I can maybe even, there we go. It says let participate. Paula, are you able to? For some reason, our chat has not been working so well. She will probably email us. She put her hand down. We'll leave the things. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You can make her a contributor, and if you do that, then she can use her chat and audio, video.
It looks like I think she just left. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Paula is here again. I've made her. I'm trying to. Are we able to hear you, Paula? Oh, there we go. There she is. Maybe you have to unmute. You can't unmute someone else. No, I think you've got yourself muted there, perhaps, Paula. Floor is yours if we can hear you.
Yeah, you're on mute, Paula. You can unmute yourself.
Oh, I'll tell you what, I'll connect with Paula. I'll find out what that question was, and we'll address that for everyone, okay? But again, Chris, thanks again for preparing the session. It was great, very informative. Certainly very informative for me, for somebody who didn't know too much about metadata at all before the call here. So appreciate the time and the effort. And for that, we will let everyone go and get back to your day. Yep. We'll talk to you again real soon.
Yes. Thank you all.
Very much. All right.
Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.